Nuremberg, and tell me what brings you there.
I had been in Europe for the better part of a year as a combat engineer, starting combat engineers. Went across Europe, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. And was, toward the end of the war, transferred out to what was called the Present Psychological Warfare Division under General Bradley. And we were in Germany and learned that our unit was going to probably go to Japan, the war being over. I started scurrying around to try to find something else to do that would let me finish out my time. I did not have enough points to go out, return home when the war was over. And I got a job with American Forces Network, whose headquarters were in Paris. And I was at AFN headquarters in their, what they call their program department. And what we were doing was we were mounting campaigns, morale building, health protecting. I remember one that I was working on at the time was a campaign, and these consisted of doing commercials, writing commercials against venereal disease. In fact, Time magazine, I remember, did a piece on it because, of course, it's doing radio spots, even in Europe, to American troops, telling them that venereal disease means trouble. VDMT was a big campaign thing that I remember in those days. It was very bold. And so I was one of a number of writers who was on projects of that kind. And one day, out of a clear blue, I was a non-com T5. I was summoned to the head of the commanding officer of AFN, who was a man named John Hayes, full Colonel John Hayes, who had been in civilian life. He was manager of QXR for the New York Times. He later, after the war was over, became ambassador to Switzerland, Thompson appointed ambassador to Switzerland. He also headed up the television radio properties for the Washington Post after he left the Army. John Hayes called me in and said that he had a significant assignment that he wanted to talk to me about. Very sensitive, and from what he had been able to learn, my qualifications, background seemed to be in tune with what they needed. And it was to go to Nuremberg to cover the trial. And if AFN planned to give it extensive coverage on the orders of the high command. So two reasons. One is that they wanted the troops to know what had happened in Germany during the Hitler years. And also, they wanted the German people to get an unbiased account, or what we would consider an objective unbiased account. And as you may know, back in those days, really the AFN, American Forces Network, was really a powerful radio network. It had more coverage over Europe than any other single network, including the BBC. We had maybe 50 or 60 radio stations at that time, all wherever American troops were. And of course they had started winding down, but still we had a lot of soldiers in Germany. And of course I asked him why he had chosen me, and he said, well, I see that you have had news background, and I had sort of grown up on the Memphis commercial appeal as a reporter. And I guess it was pretty well known that I was a fairly competent writer, based on my, at that time, 4 or 5 months having been with ASN. And he said, based on also what I found out, I don't think you're carrying any kind of political baggage with you one way or the other, so I think you would report objectively on this trial. And as you may remember, there was some controversy as to whether or not the trial should be held at all, the format of the trial, whether or not the Germans. And he said, do you have any specific views on that? And I said, not really. I said, I think they should be held. There's no ideology that's going to get me on. And he asked me to go over to see his boss, who was a man who later ended up at Reader's Digest, named Paul Thompson, who was at the time a Major General, and all the AFN Stars and Stripes Yanks in Europe all reported to him. He just wanted to meet me. And so I went over to see him. We had a talk for 20 minutes or so. And he said to me, I want you to regard yourself as a correspondent, the equal of any other news organization. I know that you're an enlisted man, but at that time we weren't wearing stripes anyway. We did have patches that said ASN, but he said, I'll get you a correspondence patch. It meant a lot because you were treated as a civilian, then the simulated rank of captain. And he said, if you ever have any trouble from any officer because of your rank, you just let me know. And so I thanked him for that. So we went, and see, I was not going to do the broadcast. I was just going to do the writing. I did not have the voice to do the announcing. I had much more pronounced Southern accent than probably I have now, because I was more recently out of the class. And so the two of us, fellow Bernhard, who was the first guy I went up with, and I went to Nuremberg a couple of days before the trial started, which I think was November 20th. And got ourselves lined up and had to be sure that we were going to get on the air. AFN did not have a station in Nuremberg, so we had to get them to patch up over the German telephone system, land round to our station down in Munich, which was our postal station. We were able to do that. And we were given 15 minutes a day at 9 o'clock at night, prime time, to as long as we wanted it. One sort of an amusing thing in retrospect, of course there were a lot of correspondence there. Nuremberg was the most level city, Munich and Cologne perhaps, in Germany. And they had to press out about 10 miles out of, 12 miles out of Nuremberg at a schloss that had been built by the Faber family, F-A-B-E-R, from Eberhard Faber, the pencil company. And it was, in its day, it must have been a magnificent place. It had all the big rooms, a lot of bedrooms, and it had some servant quarters and things that were probably a staff of 100 people. It was just a magnificent And correspondence was billeted out there. Some of them were. There was one hotel that was fairly intact, but the real favorite place was out at the Schloss. This guy who was running the thing, who was a colonel, his name was Clarence Lovejoy, and he was a yachting editor previously for the New York Times. And he had his problems on accommodating people because he didn't have enough places to put people. And so when I went up to get my credentials, I started getting a hard time from junior officers because they saw what my real rank was. And I was, in those days, and I suspect even today in the Army, there's a big chasm between an officer and enlisted man. And so I ended up in front of Lovejoy, and he said, well, wouldn't you be more comfortable being with the enlisted men? And the enlisted men's barracks, he was going to put me with the drivers and I said, absolutely not. I can't do my job with it. I've got to have access to these people. And the other thing, he said, well, the other thing about it is, we charge the correspondent 25 cents a day. And he said, the Army is obligated to provide you with rations. And he said, I don't know how we would account for it if you didn't pay. And he said, and it's not right for you to have to pay. So it would be a lot easier if you ate at the enlisted men's mess. And I said to him, well, there's only one recourse that I have, and that is called General Thompson. And Thompson, of course, had no direct command thing over him. He didn't take that really too seriously at the beginning. And during that process, I found out that Howard K. Smith, whom I did not know, was chairman of the Correspondence Committee. That was sort of the grievance committee, to handle all those issues. And I went up to see Howard and told him what my problem is. And so he accepted that I was correspondent. So he went to bat for me. I continued to use it. So I was going to get to General Thompson. He found out who Thompson was. So I was allowed the privileges of going to Bobby Schrock and eating every minute. But, the other thing that differentiated me from just about almost anybody down there, and the reason I got to be such good friends with the likes of Cronkite and Smith and Sullivan and Dan Duluth, who was the AP man down there, I had a Jeep. And also I had petrol. I had orders that said I could go into a fuel dump and get gasoline anytime I wanted to. Because I was doing irregular, because we were coming on at 9 o'clock at night. They did have bus service for the correspondents, but the AFN just let me have a Jeep. But I went to Nuremberg. So we used to take Saturdays that these people could come back and forth with me, odd hours, and I'd have to send their buses. So that's the preliminary.
Nuremberg. Did you get policy directives from your military?
Never got a policy directive. No one censored me. There was nothing free. And literally, the only things that I got from time to time would be a telephone call, I think one handwritten note saying, I heard you last night, and you guys certainly have done a good job, that sort of thing. But there was no after the fact censorship, commentary, guidance. Basically it said play it straight, as though you were doing it for the, AP.
You never got called up on anything?
Never got called up on anything.
I'm curious to get a sense of the range of the broadcast. Now, your line up to Munich goes to a broadcast station transmitter.
Yeah.
What would have
They put
been
me on the network.
what would have been the power of that outlet? You know, the wattage.
Oh, Munich was 50,000 watts.
Really, 50,000.
Look, AFN Munich was the most powerful radio station in Europe.
Yeah.
And not only, but in addition to that, we had AFN. We had 50 stations in Europe.
So you're getting a.
I went to the network.
Right.
I went all over the network.
So first of all, you're emanating from a very powerful 50,000 watt station. On top of it, you got lines out to a 50 station network.
50 stations.
So that virtually any GI in Europe
That's right.
can hear AFN.
That's right. No, and also, we later found, and and that's what we knew. The AFN news was really the most widely listened to news throughout Europe by all the responsible people.
Yeah. You had said that one of the objectives of the Army in having you there was not only to let the GI know why these trials are being conducted and how, but to give the Germans a sense that this is a fair judicial process. Do you have a sense of how much German listenership you got? Because you're broadcasting in English.
That's in English, yeah. But AFN, again, you see, AFN was basically, had all the music. It was a lot of music, so, any of these music stations got, still do in Europe, get tremendous listenership, as they do here.
Give me a sense, Mr. Burson, of the programming for a typical day. Let's say the radio's on all day long, yeah.
Well, AFN, which is a story in itself, was actually the best radio network in the world from a quality standpoint for this simple reason. It could draw on the three major networks in the United States, anything that they broadcast. For example, if, CBS had Jack Benny,
right,
and NBC had Fred Allen, and Mutual at the time had so-and-so, you have to listen to three networks. We had the top people. We would have, on any given Sunday night, we would have a lineup that had Benny and Fred Allen and Eddie Cantor and whatever those, Bob Hope, all those big people.
That's provided gratis by the network.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And how, I'm always interested in technically how things happen.
Yeah.
Would you tape these things?
No, there was an organization, and it still is in existence here today, called Armed Forces Radio Service.
Right.
And Armed Forces Radio Service used to send us. Now, we couldn't do it simultaneously. We would lag probably 3 weeks to a month, but we would get those record discs.
The big transcription.
Transcription discs, yeah, they were like, 16-inch, I think.
So you're getting all of the radio comedy of that era.
Yeah, and also big bands.
Big bands.
Drama, for example, Orson Welles type stuff, Lux Radio Theater, GE Circle Playhouse, or whatever they called it, that Reagan was on. Well, he wasn't on it then, until later on. The U.S. Steel Hour, all the really top shows.
And then did you have hourly news?
And then we had hourly, actually it wasn't hourly, AFN, wait a minute, yes we did. We had 5 minutes at the top of each hour.
Yeah.
And then we had 10 minutes or 15 minutes at 6 in the morning, noon, 6 in the evening, and 9 o'clock, I think, in the evening. About 4 times to 5 times they would have 15-minute news show. Now, you see, what also was happening was, and we originated also a lot of our own dramatic stuff. So, for example, we had at one point, right after the war, I can remember, in residence with us doing dramatic stuff, Mickey Rooney, Marlena Dietrich, Celeste Holmes, Sam Wanamaker.
This is out of Munich?
No, this was out of Frankfurt. This was after I left.
Yeah. After
the war. Yeah. And they were always getting those people as they came through on USO stuff.
Where did you wind up billeted in the sign in the Caplo?
And I had a
You had a room?
yeah.
Did you have to share it with anybody?
I didn't. I was no different from anybody else. I think I did share with the guy that I was.
You have your meals there too?
Yeah, at the castle. Yeah.
Are they worth a quarter?
Oh, absolutely. Good food. Good food. Bar, was like, I forget what the drinks were. I forget how much a mark was 10 cents, I think. And a drink was like 1 mark or 2 marks.
Can't afford not to drink.
Can't afford not to drink. And most of the times, if you remember, the time in the bar. And see, I had a broadcast at 9 o'clock, so I'd get back there around 10 or so, and things would start going pretty good then. And I can remember some of the Russian correspondents in the past who, in this land of plenty, would look at the bar and almost say one of each, and they like to see the different colors of the drinks, and they would like crème de menthe, and they'd like a Cointreau that was white, and then they'd like to get something red, and then they'd just take literally chug out one of each, and no, it was it was very exciting.
Are they there? The Russians, are they there in the same? They live in the Faber Castle. They eat with you guys. They drink with you guys.
Yeah.
You get along with them?
Oh yeah. They were nice.
They're fun guys.
Yeah. I can remember one particularly, a big burly sort of guy. I didn't speak a hell of a lot of English. That was a big problem in communicating. One spoke more English than the other, and I forget who it was. He was the head. And he would try to be. He was very jovial, camaraderie type. There was, I guess, in residence no more. There was a past people. There was Dmitri Tibetsky and Prof. There must have been a half dozen Russians.
Did you ever have any sense that of these people being under political control, or any of them yanked?
I had no sense of it. Back in those days, I have to believe they were. And I don't know what they wrote. But we never got to any. Well, the only thing that basically was, the big. There was a school of thought, not only Russian, but a lot of people in this country shared it, and that is that the Nuremberg trial was holding it. Number one, it couldn't be fair because it was all stacked against it. You were going through a big charade. The best thing that you should do is to have a court-martial and let it run the usual length of the court-martial, a week or so, and then take them out and shoot them. And the Russians, pretty well, that I talked to, they were communicated with, and it's no big sample at all, seemed to be strong in that position. Although they enjoyed being where they were.
That would come out in typical reporter barroom conversation.
Right.
You mentioned Lovejoy. Does he stay throughout the time you were there?
He was there, yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Is he the top public relations?
No, he was not. No, he ran the facilities.
He just ran the castle.
The top man whom I got to know very well, for whom I had tremendous respect and admiration, he helped me in this thing, was Gordon Dean.
That's, okay.
Gordon Dean.
The guy that wound up at the AEC.
He was chairman of the AEC. He was the press officer for Justice Jackson, the head of the American delegation.
Yeah, what do you call about any dealings with Dean then?
Oh, Dean was an absolute, he number one, he supported me in anything that I wanted to do. He let it be known that if I wanted access to anybody in the American delegation, that he would certainly get it for me. If I wanted it with other delegates, he would serve as liaison and talk to anybody.
Yeah.
If I needed any backgrounding, he gave me the opportunity to do the very first interview, which is in those papers that Justice Jackson gave.
Why don't you walk me through that one?
I really don't. I just, I remember. I don't remember any of it because I had, written questions. Of course, I was 24 years old at the time. And, a man who had been who was a Supreme Court justice, and me in my lowly position in the Army, held him in tremendous awe. And he made me feel very much at ease, and invited me to come back to see him. But I can't remember the substance of it, but it's written. I haven't read those things in years, frankly.
I get a pattern of opinion about Justice Jackson I'd like to try out on you.
Okay.
I get a sense of a man who was pretty much universally admired for his legal skills, his probity, his character. A certain amount of criticism of the fact that the man could become very impassioned and emotional, particularly after his first cross-examination of Goering, which was a very trying experience, that he would become angry at the court outside, not in front of with their consideration.
Because they were too far for the Senate.
Did you have any sense of his?
My reaction to Jackson and most of the visible, when I say visible, the people who really took to the, who did the cross-examination or the presentation on the courtroom floor. The American delegation was probably all competent, decent, I think, honorable people. But with very, very few exceptions, they had no sense of history whatsoever relative to what had happened in Europe. This was a cram course for them, and the frustration that Jackson had was that Goering or any of those that they, when they could cross-examination situations, could make them look like monkeys because these people did not know the history.
Yeah.
And so the only possible exception of that, and he played a relatively secondary role up until during the time I was at the trial. He became much more important in the second round of cases, and that was Telford Taylor.
He does have a grasp.
Taylor had a grasp of it.
Yeah.
He had a much better grasp.
I'm going to be talking to him.
But you had, the two principal attorneys under Jackson was a man named Story, who was a very competent railroad attorney.
Alderman.
Yeah.
Sidney Alderman.
And
the Southern Railway.
That's right. And his with the other one was Story too, right. Another man too.
Story.
And then the other one was Thomas Dodd, Senator Dodd's father.
Right.
Very competent guy, very nice man.
Yeah.
But again, political background. Now, the people who really knew that history and all was the British attorneys, and they just so far shown. And since the American delegation was playing to the American press, Sir Hartley Shawcross, who was the chief prosecutor for Britain,
right.
Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. These were the real stars of this thing. They could go just tongue and just right at Goering and hold their own with him. And they really had this marvelous grasp. They wouldn't have to ask an aide, was it in 1941 or was it 1942? These guys really knew that stuff. And so I think there was probably a frustration, on the part of the American delegation out of the fact that they were not as knowledgeable about this period of history. And the memory that I have of that trial that I will carry forever is, if a movie is done on this, you could not typecast a better presiding judge than Sir Jeffrey Lawrence. And he was, he was meticulous. Yes, he was, he made the prosecution toe to the same standard, if not even a greater standard, than the defense. He recognized that the defense had its limitations. They were dependent on getting documents, for example, from the prosecution. They didn't have resources, so they had to request documents. And there were, whenever there appeared to be games on withholding a certain document that somebody wanted or couldn't be found, Lawrence was really, I just can't understand why you can produce these obscure things and how you don't, So he would make them, call him a heel, and so he was a puckish sort of a guy right out of Dickens, a really great character. But Jackson, I think he did a very credible job, but he certainly was not the star of that.
You know that Jim Farley came over there to talk to Jackson about a presidential bid. Did you have any sense that Jackson had one eye on politics?
That was said that, why would a sitting Supreme Court judge be interested in that? And the recollection was, you see, it was Truman who appointed him, or was it? Yeah, Truman who appointed him, that he might possibly be, a vice presidential candidate, with Truman, who, when he served out the unexpired Roosevelt term, and also he was mentioned as a presidential candidate. I found no evidence, whatsoever that he overtly. Now he may have thought that this was going to be the stepping stone to being called, but I did not.
There was another dean who was mentioned in a public relations capacity, Ernie Dean.
Ernie Dean was a major who had been, I forget which army he was with, and he was part of a mechanism that really provided resources for reporters. Reporters required places to work. They required a constant flow of documents that were presented during the course of the trial. They provided they needed housing, they needed transportation, they needed communications facilities. And the Army, what it did was it drew on various of its press units that were out in the field, which now are being deactivated. And Ernie, I first met him in Paris. He was at the Scribe Hotel, which was, the center of the press in Paris. And he was another friend of fellow died a couple of years ago, Don Carney, Kearney, was captain. He was part of that thing. And these basically, they were not policy people at all. They were facilitators, arrangements, logistics type people. And Ernie was in that category.
On the subject of logistics, can you describe for me the facility that you broadcast from? Was one in the palace and one over in the castle?
No, there was nothing in the castle.
The broadcast were done. Did you go on the air yourself?
I never on myself.
I
would always be.
You're the writer.
I would always be with the guy who I had during the course of my time. I had 4 broadcasters. And the reason for this is that these other guys had been in the Army longer than I had, and they were going home and they were rotating. One of them was Bernhardt from here in Brooklyn. Another one was named Ted Pierce. and another one was Jack. But the last one became a fairly well-known, and is, radio announcer, commentator, news guy here in TV, Herb Caplo.
I know Herb.
Yeah, Herb Caplo was my last reader.
So at that point,
and he succeeded me after I left.
So they're like radio announcers.
Well, yeah, you know.
You're doing the script, they get up and read it with a mellifluous radio voice.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's what was done a lot,
Yeah.
you know.
And where do they broadcast from?
Okay. There was a broadcast booth at House Justice.
Yeah.
And we had booked it for every night during the week, 5 days a week, for 9 o'clock well, we wanted to got in at 8:45, and we left it at 9:15.
Yeah.
And now it was the same place where Howard would broadcast to his, you know, when he made his deal to CBS, got back to CBS, how he got there, the NBC people got back to, you know,
there's one broadcast booth in the palace. Where is it location of the court? What floor is it on?
it was not overlooking the court.
Right.
It was not overlooking it. It was in another part of the building. And actually, I think there were probably a couple of other booths up there because you know, you had to have more than one place. Because, yeah.
There's a lot of
See, I was not aware of how they did it because what happened was, from a logistics standpoint, and I prefer to work this way, I was very, meticulous about going to trial every day. And I would get there, you know, at the opening bell, 10 o'clock in the morning, I think it usually started. And we'd break for about an hour for lunch. And then the afternoon session would almost invariably end at 4 o'clock. Now, the 4 o'clock then was about 10 o'clock here. So these guys were really peeling off about 6 o'clock, about noon, you know, the 6 hours difference, and doing their broadcast back to the States, you know, at noon, and certainly no later than about, you know, some maybe for the 6 o'clock, and then, you know, for the 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock news. Back then, the radio was more 9 o'clock now. So they had to be at 3 o'clock. So they were peeling out during the day, and I never did, for some reason, I never did see that process. Because when I got there at 9 o'clock, and I was 3 o'clock in the morning, I was the only guy using the broadcast facility.
So you're real time. They have to compensate for this.
That's right. Yeah, I was in the real. I was, you know, my time from here. And what I would do after the broadcast, after the session was over, that press room, the tremendous press room in the courthouse, must have sat 100 or more reporters. And there was typewriters, everybody typewriter, and of course, you know, portable typewriters. And it was about a 20-minute drive back to my quarters at the castle.
Yeah.
So I would go back to the castle and start writing my script. And it took me anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours to do that, particularly the 15 minutes running. And then I would have time to have dinner, and then I'd leave the place about, you know, 8:15, 8 o'clock to go down to the courthouse with my announcer guy.
Yeah.
And we would go down there, and I just wanted to be sure he was on the air and so on.
That's what I was going to ask you, why you accompanied him.
Well, I just wanted to make, you know, didn't have, I guess that's what the hell am I else to do except drink. No, that's just the work habit I got into.
Yeah.
I was there for every one of those things. I listened to how he
Where do you sit? In the booth?
Yeah, sometimes I sat in the booth. Sometimes there was a little anteroom there that I could hear how he sounded on the air.
Yeah.
So,
Were your announcers always sober?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, these guys were good. These guys were very, very good. Yeah. And it wasn't always a matter of, I don't want to do them a disservice saying that all they did was read the words I put in their mouth. They were, coming up with ideas and saying, I think this should be featured and that should be featured. But mainly those scripts that you see there were generally solitary, particularly as the trial went on.
I think it was also a working press room at the castle. Oh, if you wanted to, you could have written your piece there.
Yeah, too, yes.
What kind of, I love detail. What kind of typewriters are you using?
Usually, what the hell was the name of that German typewriter? It was a German typewriter, those tinny type things, because they were German.
What's that? That'll occur to you later.
If you can see the thing so clearly, and you can see the typewriter.
Does it look much different than our Underwood?
Oh, no. Well, Underwood didn't have a portable, I don't think. It looked more like an L.C. Smith, a Royal portable.
I gather we could say that the correspondents got pretty good support then from the government and military.
I think so. The one thing that was so very totally off limits was the prisoners, the defendants.
Yeah, did you make any attempts to to interview them?
Yeah.
Tell me what happened.
In fact, I thought that I had arranged it. I worked on it for months. They said that they weren't going to do any interviews. They didn't want to break that as a matter of law. And I said, look, since I, am in the Army, and I, know what you do when you're full guard duty. I know all those guidelines and regulations. Let me be part of the guard detail one evening. Just coming in, not as a correspondent, but as a GI. Yeah. Assigned to full guard duty in the prison. Yeah. The prison was adjacent to the prison. They kicked that around, and I don't know who said no, but the guy I think who did was his name Stewart, who ran the prison?
No, Andrews.
Burton Andrews, exactly right. Hey, exactly right. Colonel. He, the elderly guy, fatherly type figure, had a mustache, something like yours. Yeah. I can remember him, and I can remember in front of he approached me on the bed. He didn't want to turn me down, but he said, son, this is a serious thing like that, and if something goes wrong, and so forth, nobody wants to be part of this process. And basically, it was a caution thing. I didn't want to take the place of a guard. I just wanted to be an add-on just to see what the process was. And he wouldn't go.
Did you ever get into jail?
No. Never.
I talked to Andrews' son the other day, who was a retired career military himself. He told me something fascinating. His father was dying about 1965. Old man.
Well, he was, I bet, anybody who had gray hair was old when I was 24. But I suspect Andrews was in his 50s when I was
no younger than 50. But anyway, he's on his deathbed. It's a question of time, and his son is standing the death watch with him. And all of a sudden, the old man sits up in bed, gets out, staggers towards his closet. His son runs to him. Dad, get back in bed. What's the matter with you? according to the son. One of these stories, I hope it's true. That, my father said, I've just gotten word from the cell block. Goering has committed suicide, and I have to get over to the Tripartite Commission to talk to them. He said his father died about a half an hour later.
I talked to Biddle off the record.
Yeah.
I talked to Lawrence off the record, but the court, as a court, decided on policy that they would not be available for interviews except for attribution.
That raises a question. I'm puzzled by something. I'm sure you're familiar with this book by Bradley Smith on the trials at Nuremberg. Or maybe not. Anyway, a guy named Bradley Smith wrote a book called Reaching Judgment at Nuremberg. It's a rather controversial book, written about 20 years ago. And in it, on one page, he talks about, in December of 1945, Hermann Goering giving an interview to the press.
Inconceivable.
Yeah, I read it. Nobody could get in the jail. Nobody could get in the interview. They're not going to trot this guy out for a press conference.
Inconceivable.
Good. Okay.
I just could not believe that.
So
he played to the press when he was, in the docket, in the dock. He knew where the press was sitting, and he would, grandstand, and he would look up, he would make a remark, and, he was ad-libbing from time to time, and usually very funny. The one thing about Goering is that, I was not the only one, but I remember the first day that Goering testified, the comment was, I think I've written the word in my script, but thank God that Hitler was running it, not Goering. Goering, I think, was making a stupid mistake.
Yeah. Well, he sounds like a formidable personality. One of the guys I interviewed was in the interrogation business, and he told about getting a request from the Russian side. There were two Russian, I'm not sure they may have been intelligence types, but they came to Nuremberg. They wanted to see Goering. They insisted on he was very tough on race, very, I guess what we would call a Stalinist type. And they were uneasy about letting these Russians in with Goering. They were afraid that maybe he might be torn apart by them, because the Russians had a pretty strong animus against the Nazis, stronger certainly than the Americans or the Brits. But there was no way they could refuse this request. And they allowed the visit with Goering, and were sitting nearby the interrogation room. Goering was in there with the Russians. The door was closed. This fellow I talked to posted himself nearby. He said, silence fell, and then he said there was a laugh. Then there was a louder laugh. Then there was a belly laugh, and he said for the next 20 minutes there was nothing but laughter coming out of that room. And he realized that Goering had turned this perverse charm of his on.
Very familiar, man. He was, he had lost a lot of weight. And he came in these, absolute magnificent hairless uniforms. Field marshal type uniforms, and, in sort of a fawn. He had one of fawn, he had a gray, very pastel colors, I remember. And he would sail into that courtroom, like a ship under full sail. But you knew that who was the dominant figure in that. Certainly among the trial people, from those in trial, but also probably the most dominant person in that courtroom was Goering. Most charismatic, commanding leader.
What can you recall, Mr. Burson, of the mood, the atmosphere of opening day?
A sense of being a witness to something in history that never had been done before. You had a lot of press people there, big names who came, for the first couple of days and then left. It was an electricity and excitement that, this is, a noble experience, experience leading us into this great new world that we were getting into. There were some skeptics, again, this is all ex post facto law. But I think it was a serious, taken very, very seriously, and people had a lot of anticipation for it. And particularly, most people gathered there a couple of days ahead of time. It was like waiting for the big event to start.
D-Day. Yeah. Has to be a crush of reporters around.
But see, that was limited by the capacity of being able physically to handle them. In those days, the Army controlled all of the facilities. And it was just, they had a number and they couldn't exceed that number because they literally couldn't proceed at all. Just unbelievable how devastated Nuremberg was.
You ever walked around town?
Oh, yes, many times. Not only around town, but around the old city, which was absolutely flat, And also, it got to be very, very depressing because, there was still a lot of people living in Nuremberg, and they had to live, in these basements, like, buried in the ground, trying to, keep the water out. It was a cold winter. That was one thing you got to remember. It was a cold winter. That winter of 1946 was one of the coldest winters Europe has had. It's still cited as one of the cold winters. And these poor people were, there was no fuel. There was, very little food. And the housing was, extremely primitive. And most of it underground.
I have a very strong sense from what I've done so far of contrast, because you have this world you've just described, German populace. And then in the Grand Hotel, and the Faber Castle, food, you got coal.
Tremendous. I got to know the technicians who were German. Our technical staff at this castle. The people who put us on the air, the Germans. And there were several women, a couple of guys, and I was always, putting oranges in my pocket, rolled, making money. These guys. So they were really very committed and dedicated to doing, helping us.
Yeah.
And so it was a tremendous contrast.
Are any of these people ex-Wehrmacht?
No.
These are civilians.
Civilians for whatever reason. And I'd say mostly women.
Mostly women.
But there were a couple of guys there who, the men that I ran into in Germany, and every now and then, we'd go to a bar, have a drink after the thing, and there were a few spots that you could go to there and get beer. Beer was about the only thing you could get. And a lot of Americans, a lot of GIs, some American civilian news people. The German women were always catering to the American men because they had money and they had food. The German men were just downtrodden, put upon, beat up. Really, they just the manhood taken away from them. Men went out and lost their war. And So they weren't very, the ones that I met during that period, and again, not very many, did not seem to be very assertive at all.
Yeah. There's no problem at this point with fraternization between
officially. I think fraternization was not taken off until after the start of 1946. Officially, but
through 45, which is the first 4 months of the trial, 3 months of the trial, or well, by the time the people are arriving in August. At that point, supposedly there's an official non-fraternization.
Non-fraternization, exactly, and
kind of hard to stop horizontal fraternization.
It was impossible. It was impossible to stop it on both sides. But they'd already. But down in Nuremberg, as I recall, in these little bars, you would openly be with German women.
Yeah.
And it was no problem. What happened was, I think, as the war ended. After the war ended,
right.
I think the rule was still on the books, but it was not, very rigidly enforced.
Yeah. Every place I've ever been, I've been in a lot of political campaigns, did a lot with reporters. There's always a reporter's hangout. Was there a particular?
Well, the primary was Grand Hotel.
Yeah. Now, in your ambivalent status, do you go to the Grand Hotel?
I didn't go down there very much because I didn't finish until 9:15 or so. It's going to take me, half hour to get back to the castle there, and I got up the next morning. But I just was not that much of a night, and also I liked the bar out at the Stein.
When did you leave?
On that trip, but as near as I can remember, toward the middle of March. I left after, I think, von Ribbentrop testified,
Yeah.
and the reason, and I knew I was going home. You see, you always knew which number your points, about when you were going home.
Right.
I knew I was going home at the end of May, toward the middle of May, and I wanted to allow myself. I had a lot of leave coming, and I had a lady friend. I wasn't married at the time. I had a lady friend in Paris that I wanted to go back and spend 3-4 weeks with, and so I did.
Yeah.
And and it also got after, you had the Goering testimony, and you had the, I think I heard Keitel and Ribbentrop and maybe Yodel. But it all started getting more of the same. I'd been through this story 40 times, in the presentation of the case, so I just didn't think it was really that interesting anymore, and I wanted to get out of there so I'd go home and have my leave.
Nuremberg is a magnet for a lot of celebrity names that period, both on the journalistic side and other things. For example, Virgil Thompson comes to Nuremberg. Rebecca West comes.
I remember her. In fact, I had dinner with her one night.
Well, tell me about it. What kind of gal was she?
Very, very bright, very perceptive, very opinionated. She obviously knew more about that scene than anybody around the table that she was being lionized by. And she did some, I remember reading a couple of pieces after she left. And
what's Janet Planner like? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, I remember her myself. She was, she was then a woman, I would say, in her late 50s, had lived in Paris all of her life, and again, came to it with, a knowledge base that even the best of the American correspondents, just didn't have. I guess, the American correspondent, Howard Smith, had been touched around and this, that. He had lived had come out of Oxford, he had lived in Berlin, and that sort of thing. So he knew what the history was. Most of the people would basically, if it didn't get said, it was not contained in a document. They didn't know it. Because it was a history, a story based on a lot of roots.
Any dealing with Henry Higgins?
Oh, absolutely. I used to bring her home. She was the hardest working, let me put it this way, she put in more hours in the press room than anybody covering that job. Whereas, when I would go home at 9:15, you'd go look in the press room, and there may have been some, stray Czechoslovak correspondents or Poles or somebody like that there. The only American in sight was Marguerite. And she was pretty close to my age at the time. And I got to know her quite well. And she, as she moved on through her journalistic career, she became more of a femme fatale. Then she was before she took off some weight. She was at that big, she was about 5'8", 9", woman, and sort of heftiest frame. And she wore these, rugged wool stockings, very unfeminine, in those days. And I saw her a great deal of it, and it just sort of became a part of my regimen that I would go down to see if she was there. Because if I wasn't there, I think there was a bus that left there at 10 o'clock. We'd have to wait 45 minutes to get back to the castle. But she was doing two things. She was not only writing for the Herald Tribune back here, which had, the early deadline, but she was also writing for the Paris Tribune. And she had about an 8 or 5 second on that. So she was she worked very, very hard. I got to know her very well. She, just graduated a couple of years before. I thought she was Scotland.
She all business?
With me she was, and she was all business. At that time, she got a somewhat different reputation in the Korean War. But as far as she was sort of a very total business type person.
You were wearing the correspondence?
Package. Oh, no, I never saw her for any mileage in a dress. She had, the package skirts and blouse and
she's blonde.
She's blonde.
But some of your contemporaries who I have interviewed say were very attractive. You're giving me a much more realistic picture of her.
She had the potential that she would really. Makeup wasn't one of her big things. I don't think she spent much time with her hair. She just wasn't, she wasn't a crackpot.
Are there guys hustling her?
I don't think so. I think the feeling about it, and they say I spend much time, I think, with almost anybody, was that she was there to cover that story.
Somebody told me, confirming what you said, but this woman worked so hard that she had a breakdown and they lugged her out of the place. You remember that?
It could have been after that.
It really was.
No, she was.
Worked up in the city draw.
Right. She was there all day for the trial, and I tell you, there were very few nights that I would go down there and not see her. I had a counterpart on Stars and Stripes there at the time. His name was Alan Dreyfus.
Yeah.
ALANDREYFUS. Alan is at the Ford Motor Company now. He is a speechwriter. He was a lot. He wrote Ford speeches. He stayed in Europe several years after the war with Radio Free Europe. And he was the greatest ever around. He knew a lot of those people in the media there too.
I'm going to give him a call.
Great rocking too.
Oh, good.
Great rocking.
I must call him. I have his number.
I think that's fantastic memory. But Alan is out, and he lives in Ann Arbor, but he works in the Detroit corporate headquarters in Detroit for Ford. Knew Walter not well. I had two, United Press, which is pre-UPI, United Press had 4 people there, and John McCormick headed the bureau of the group there, and I knew them very well. See, I was in a very peculiar position because I had certain access that they wanted, and I was making certain contacts that they wanted, and I was not competitive with anybody else. I was not competitive with anybody. So I got to know, for example, Wes Gallagher and Dan Duluth from AP, and very close friends of mine. And also, I could, as a GI, ask questions, and also it was pretty well known that Gordon Dean was a very good friend. He sort of took a bunch of interest in me. So, I could ask some of these questions that they wouldn't want to ask themselves. And so I got to know. Well, I knew, and then it's the UP delegation. There was a fellow named Pat Congo was there, whom I didn't know quite so well. But Ann Stringer was a woman there that I knew very well. And then Corncastle was there. And so, I used to see him, every day. And we would talk a little bit, but I never did. I was never really very close to him. It was regarded as the outstanding achievement in the way of simultaneous translation. You could just, it was, it's what we take for granted today. You turn your dial to 4 different languages.
We're going to teach it to do it on an airplane.
Right.
But back then, the people who developed that was very interesting.
Yeah, it was very, I remember we used to just switch on the dial and listen to the Russian rolling, and it was just amazing how good translation. Everybody gave translation very well. It's something that came in a very early age for me, as I say, 24 years old. It's something that I shall always remember. Did it in any way shape, what my career. I doubt it, if I had, been discovered there as having done such a superior job, and then somebody just one of the networks said, we got to have the guy who's behind all this. That would have been wonderful. That didn't happen. So, it was I see it as a very interesting episode in my life.